For 34 years, I believed my name, my family, and my life were real, until one hidden file from 1991 revealed I was adopted to protect a secret worth over $120 million. My parents were not saving me, they were hiding me, and the moment I discovered the truth, everything they built began to crack. My name is Marin, and this is the story of how silence became my strongest revenge. Chapter 1: The File That Should Never Exist. I grew up believing my life was exactly what it was supposed to be: safe, predictable, comfortable in a way people admire from the outside and never question. I lived in New York, worked in compliance for a major financial institution, and carried the Whitlock name like a credential that opened doors before I even reached for the handle. My parents lived in Connecticut, in a house that had hosted more fundraisers than birthday parties. Everything about my life looked correct. And yet, I had always felt like an extra piece in a perfectly designed system. At family gatherings, I was introduced as the responsible one, the smart one, the daughter who never caused trouble. Caleb, my younger brother by adoption, was the future. He was charismatic, ambitious, and openly groomed to take over Whitlock Holdings one day. When relatives asked about succession, my father would place a hand on Caleb's shoulder and smile. When they asked about me, my mother would say I had a good career and leave it at that. No one ever said it out loud, but I was the supporting structure, necessary, replaceable, useful as long as I stayed within my lane. I told myself I was fine with that. I had built a life around rules and distance. Compliance was a natural fit for someone like me. I made a living by finding what did not belong, by tracing inconsistencies, by reading what others skipped. I believed order was protection. I believed clarity was safety. The day everything shifted started like any other workday. I was reviewing internal exposure reports connected to legacy trusts and family-linked assets, part of a routine audit I had done dozens of times before. Whitlock Holdings appeared on my screen more often than I liked, but I treated it like any other entity. Professional distance mattered. Objectivity mattered. That morning, a file appeared that should not have been accessible to me. It was locked behind an outdated encryption protocol, one the firm had phased out years ago. I should not have been able to open it, but systems remember things people forget. I entered a standard override sequence out of habit, expecting a denial message. Instead, the file opened. It was a trust fund, established in 1991. The structure was old-fashioned but meticulous, the kind used when people wanted control without visibility. The initial amount was substantial, enough to grow quietly over decades. What stopped me was not the number, it was the beneficiary line. The last name was not Whitlock. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. My first instinct was to assume coincidence. People share birthdays. Data can overlap. But when I scrolled down, my breath caught in a way I had never felt before. The date of birth listed was mine: month, day, year. I closed the file. Then I opened it again. Compliance trains you not to panic. Panic leads to mistakes. I told myself this was an error, a clerical oversight from 3 decades ago. Still, my hands were unsteady as I logged out and shut down my workstation. I did not tell anyone. I did not document the access. I carried the information home like a weight I didn't know where to set down. That night, I took out my birth certificate for the first time in years. I had never had a reason to look at it closely before. It had always been just another document, filed and forgotten. Under the warm light of my kitchen, the paper looked older than I remembered. The hospital was listed as a private facility in Boston. I had always assumed I was born in Connecticut. No one had ever corrected me. The attending physician's name was unfamiliar. When I searched it, I learned he had passed away over a decade ago. The line from mother's name was partially obscured by an attached legal addendum. I unfolded the additional page slowly. It referenced a non-disclosure agreement. No names, no explanation, just a statement that identifying details were sealed. I sat at my table until the city outside my window went quiet. I was not afraid. I was alert. There's a difference. Fear is loud. This was sharp and contained. The next weekend, I drove to Connecticut for dinner. It was a planned visit, one I would have made regardless. My parents' house looked the same as it always had. Manicured lawn, symmetrical windows, a place designed to project permanence. My mother greeted me with a kiss on the cheek and asked about work. My father talked about market trends and upcoming board meetings. Caleb arrived late, full of energy, already halfway through a story before he sat down. At some point between the salad and the main course, I asked my mother about my birth. I kept my tone casual. I asked where I had been born, whether it had been a difficult delivery, whether there were any complications. She paused just long enough for me to notice. Then she smiled and said everything had gone smoothly. She told me I had always been easy, quiet, independent from the beginning. I told her I had found a discrepancy in some paperwork. I said it was probably nothing, but I wanted to confirm details. Her expression didn't change, but the air in the room did. She told me not to overthink things. She said paperwork from the early 90s was often messy. She reminded me that I had been given every opportunity a child could want. When I asked directly about the non-disclosure agreement attached to my birth records, she set her fork down. She said some things are better left untouched. She said families function because not everything needs to be examined. She did not raise her voice. She did not deny anything outright. She simply redirected the conversation back to safer ground. My father said nothing. Caleb looked between us, confused but uninterested. The moment passed. On the drive back to New York, I understood something I had never allowed myself to consider. My family didn't lie the way people think of lying. They omitted. They contained. They managed narratives the way they managed assets. Back in my apartment, I returned to the trust file. This time, I read it as myself, not as an employee. I followed the chain of custody. I traced the legal language. Near the medical references, I found a name buried in supporting documentation: Vivian Hale. I said it out loud once. The name did not echo. It settled. I searched every database I had access to: employment records, corporate filings, public archives. Vivian Hale had worked as an internal financial analyst for Whitlock Holdings in the early 90s. Her tenure was short, her exit abrupt. There was no public explanation. Her name disappeared from internal documents after a certain date. I leaned back in my chair and let the silence fill the room. For the first time, the feeling I had carried my entire life made sense. The distance, the careful affection, the way love in my family always came with conditions that were never stated, but always enforced. I did not confront anyone, not yet. Confrontation demands answers, and I was not ready to hear them framed in language designed to protect everything except the truth. I understood systems, I understood leverage, and I understood that once you ask the wrong question out loud, you lose control over how the answer is shaped. So I chose silence. I began to investigate quietly, methodically, the way I had been trained to do, not as a daughter, not as a victim, but as someone who knew that files don't exist without purpose, and secrets don't survive without cost. If you have ever lived inside a family that looked flawless from the outside, but felt misaligned from within, you might understand the moment when you realize the problem was never you, it was the structure you were placed inside. And if you were in my position, would you start asking questions out loud, or would you do what I did and listen carefully before you spoke at all?
Chapter 2. The Woman They Buried Quietly. I chose to listen. That decision shaped everything that followed. Instead of confronting my parents again or alerting anyone at work, I treated Vivian Hale like a case file that had been buried on purpose, quietly, deliberately. I started with what I could access legally and invisibly: employment records, archived compliance reports, legacy directories that most people forgot still existed. Vivian Hale appeared in Whitlock Holdings records in 1990 as an internal financial analyst. Her role was specific and technical. She worked on fund structures, regulatory compliance, and internal risk controls. The kind of position given to someone trusted with uncomfortable truths. Her performance reviews were strong, precise, consistent. Then, in late 1992, she was listed as having left the company abruptly. No exit memo, no farewell note, just a single line indicating separation. After that, her name vanished. I searched for her outside the company. Public records showed she lived in Massachusetts. She had one child, a son. There was no spouse listed. In 2012, her name surfaced again in a short local article about a fatal car accident outside Boston. Single vehicle, late night, no witnesses. The investigation closed within weeks. I read the article 3 times, not because it was dramatic, but because it was empty. No follow-up, no context, just a life reduced to a paragraph and then forgotten. A week later, I drove to Massachusetts. The cemetery was quiet in the way places like that always are. Not peaceful, just restrained. I stood in front of a modest headstone with her name carved cleanly into the granite. Vivian Hale, beloved mother. No dates beyond birth and death, no corporate legacy, no hint of the role she once played inside a powerful system. I felt something shift in my chest. Not grief, not yet. Recognition, maybe, or alignment. I did not cry, I did not kneel. I simply stood there longer than necessary, as if my presence alone might be acknowledged by someone who had never been allowed to exist fully in the first place. On the drive back to my hotel, I understood that this was not just about me. Whatever had happened to Vivian Hale had been contained successfully. That kind of containment does not happen by accident. Finding her son took longer. Thomas Hale did not have much of a public footprint. He was a corporate attorney based in Boston, with a reputation for discretion. When I finally located his office, I did not walk in announcing who I thought I was. I requested a consultation under a different pretext, a routine matter, something forgettable. When he entered the room, I knew immediately who he was. He looked like her, not in obvious ways, but in posture, in the careful way he listened before responding. He asked me what I needed help with. I told him I was researching historical compliance failures connected to Whitlock Holdings. His expression tightened slightly. Not fear, awareness. I mentioned his mother's name. He told me the meeting was over. I did not argue. I thanked him for his time and left. The next morning, I sent him an email. I told him I believed my birth records were connected to his mother's work. I did not ask for confirmation. I did not ask for sympathy. I simply said I wanted to understand the truth. Days passed, then weeks. When he finally agreed to meet me again, it was in a small cafe near his office. He chose a table far from the windows. He kept his coat on, his hands wrapped tightly around his coffee cup. He told me his mother had been careful, that she believed systems only worked if someone was willing to challenge them from the inside. He said she had discovered irregularities tied to internal funds, not criminal at first glance, but dangerous if left unchecked. When she raised concerns, she was asked to sign agreements. When she refused, the tone changed. He said she left Whitlock Holdings under pressure. He said she had been afraid near the end, not panicked, calculating, the kind of fear that comes from knowing too much. When I asked him about the accident, he looked away. He said the report never made sense. He said questions were discouraged. He said lawyers appeared before he had even asked for them. I did not interrupt. I let the silence stretch between us until he said what he had clearly never planned to say out loud. He said, I was her daughter. The words did not land with force. They settled, like a missing piece clicking into place without ceremony. He told me my birth was documented, that legal arrangements were made quickly, that his mother believed the only way to protect me was to remove me from the line of fire entirely. She signed what she was told to sign. She trusted the system more than she should have. He said the adoption was never meant to be kind, it was meant to be final. I asked him why he was telling me now. He said because the past does not stay buried forever, and because I had already found what I was not supposed to see. When we parted, I did not hug him. We were not there yet. I walked back to my car with a strange clarity. I had not been abandoned. I had been shielded, not out of love, out of risk management. That realization changed the shape of my anger. It was no longer personal, it was structural. Back in New York, I reviewed everything again. My life, my upbringing, the careful boundaries my parents had maintained, the way affection was offered but intimacy was always managed. I saw it all differently now. I had not been kept at a distance because I was less valuable. I had been kept at a distance because I was too connected to something dangerous. For the first time, I understood that my position in the family was not accidental. I was not the overlooked daughter. I was the contingency they hoped would never activate. I did not cry over the truth. I did not fall apart. I felt something colder and more precise take shape inside me. A recognition of scale, of consequence, of the fact that my life had been engineered to keep a system intact. And I knew then that whatever came next would not be driven by hurt, it would be driven by clarity.
Chapter 3. Silence as Leverage. Clarity changes how time feels. Once I understood what I was dealing with, everything slowed down and sharpened at the same time. I stopped replaying old conversations in my head. I stopped wondering how things might have been different. I focused on what existed now, in black and white, inside systems that had been designed to protect themselves. I returned to my work the way I always had, methodical and quiet. Compliance had taught me how to look without being seen. I pulled records, compared filings, traced ownership chains, and mapped structures that most people assumed no one would ever revisit. The trust fund I had found was not an anomaly. It was a design. Established in 1991, seeded with $15 million, and structured to grow invisibly. Over decades, through conservative investments and careful reinvestment, it had become something far larger. Just over $120 million by the time I saw it clearly. The beneficiary was me. The control was not. The fund was frozen behind a non-disclosure condition tied to sealed medical and employment records. It was the kind of legal lock that did not exist to protect a child. It existed to protect a system from liability. If activated improperly, it would not just release money, it would trigger reviews, audits, and questions that no one in my family wanted asked. I needed to know exactly how much leverage that gave me. Julia Myers met me in her office on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. She was direct in a way that immediately put me at ease. No flattery, no dramatics. I laid out what I had found and what I suspected. She listened without interrupting, flipping through documents with the calm of someone who had seen worse. When she finally looked up, she said I had standing, full standing. She explained that the trust was legally mine, that the conditions delaying access were procedural, not absolute. She also explained the consequences. Activating the fund would invite scrutiny into how it had been created, why it had been concealed, and what agreements had been used to maintain silence. That scrutiny would not stop at financials. It would move outward, toward corporate practices, toward internal decisions, toward a death that had been closed too quickly. I asked her what she would do in my position. She did not hesitate. She said she would move carefully and say very little. That advice shaped everything that followed. Around the same time, I became aware of Daniel Ross.
He was a journalist with a reputation for patience and precision. He did not break stories quickly. He built them slowly, letting institutions expose themselves under the weight of their own inconsistencies. I reached out to him through a mutual contact, framing my interest as professional rather than personal. We met once. I did not bring documents. I did not give him names. I confirmed dates. I confirmed that certain funds existed. I confirmed that a pattern he was investigating had roots that extended further back than he suspected. He looked at me across the table and said he appreciated my restraint. I told him restraint was how systems reveal themselves. Inside Whitlock Holdings, things began to shift. A major transaction stalled unexpectedly. Compliance flagged a legacy exposure issue tied to trust structures. It was the kind of delay that could be explained away publicly, but felt alarming internally. Meetings were called. Calls were returned late. Voices rose behind closed doors. I was invited to a meeting I was never invited to before. The room was familiar, but the tone was not. My father sat at the head of the table. Caleb paced near the windows, agitation radiating from him. He spoke first, questioning how a deal that had been clean days earlier could suddenly be frozen. Someone mentioned compliance, someone mentioned oversight, then someone looked at me. Caleb turned sharply. He asked me if I knew anything about it. I told him I was reviewing a number of legacy items. I said it evenly, professionally. I did not volunteer more. After the meeting, my mother called me. Her voice was controlled, careful. She asked if I had found something I should not have. I told her I was doing my job. She reminded me again that not everything needed to be reopened. I reminded her that my role existed to reopen what had been buried incorrectly. Days later, my parents asked me to come to Connecticut. We sat in the same dining room where so many conversations had been managed rather than resolved. They asked me what I wanted, not what I knew, not what I planned to do, what I wanted. I looked at them both and understood that this was the first time they were speaking to me without the assumption of control. I told them the truth, or at least the part of it they were ready to hear. I want my name back. The room went quiet, not shocked, just still. They did not argue, they did not deny. My father nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had always known would surface eventually. My mother folded her hands in front of her and said nothing. I left without an agreement and without a confrontation. That was important. I was not here to negotiate emotionally. I was here to allow the system to recognize what it had created. Over the following weeks, the pressure increased. Reviews expanded, questions multiplied. Daniel Ross published a piece that did not name Whitlock Holdings, but described practices that were uncomfortably familiar. Investors asked about governance. Lawyers asked about exposure. Caleb became volatile. My parents became cautious. I remained quiet. Silence, when paired with preparation, is not passive. It is active restraint. It is choosing when not to speak because you know the moment is not yet correct. If you have ever been underestimated because you stayed calm, because you followed rules, because you did not demand attention, you know how tempting it is to speak too soon, to prove something, to force recognition. But tell me this, if holding your silence meant the truth would surface on its own terms and your voice would carry more weight when it finally entered the room, would you be able to wait?
Chapter 4. Blood and Terms. Waiting did not make the moment smaller. It made it inevitable. The invitation came on a Thursday morning, formal in tone and careful in wording. My parents wanted a family meeting in Connecticut, not a conversation, not dinner, a meeting. The difference mattered. I took the train that afternoon, watching the landscape change from steel and glass to trimmed hedges and long driveways, familiar territory, territory that had never quite been mine. The house looked unchanged. It always did. Order was part of the Whitlock brand. Inside, everything was already arranged. The dining room table was cleared of food and set with folders instead. My father sat at the head. My mother sat to his right. Caleb stood near the window, arms crossed, jaw tight. He looked like someone bracing for impact. No one asked how I was. We sat. Silence stretched long enough to feel intentional. Then my father spoke. "You understand why we needed to have this conversation." I nodded. I did. He did not waste time in denial. That alone told me how much had already shifted. He said my adoption had been a strategic decision. He said it plainly, without apology or ornament. He said the firm faced an exposure in the early 90s tied to internal compliance concerns. He said Vivian Hale had been central to identifying that exposure. He said the solution had been containment. My mother closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she spoke for the first time. "I believed we were protecting everyone." Her voice did not shake. She told me she had signed the papers because she was told it was the only way to keep the company intact. She told me she had believed I would have a better life without knowing. She told me she had convinced herself that love could be managed like anything else if the outcome was stability. Caleb finally spoke. "So you just took her and built a life on top of it." He looked at me, not them. Anger flickered across his face, quickly replaced by something more uncertain. Fear, maybe. He had grown up believing the future was his by design. Now the design was cracking. I did not respond to him. I did not respond to my parents either. I listened. That was the difference this time. I was not waiting for permission. I was observing a system explaining itself. They talked about legacy, about risk, about how difficult decisions sometimes had to be made to preserve institutions that employed thousands of people. They talked about responsibility as if it were a shield rather than a choice. When they finished, the room fell quiet again. I realized something then. I was not angry. I was done. I looked at them as I would look at any organizational structure, roles, incentives, behavior patterns. Once you see that clearly, emotion becomes secondary, not absent, just no longer in control. "I am not here to debate whether you loved me," I said. My voice sounded steady to my own ears. That surprised me. "I am here to address what exists now." I placed the folder I had brought with me on the table. Inside were documents prepared by Julia Myers, trust activation protocols, legal acknowledgments, waivers, everything drafted to be executed cleanly, without spectacle. My father reached for the folder but did not open it. "You know what this will do," he said. "I do." My mother leaned forward. "You would expose us." "I would expose structures," I replied. "There is a difference." I told them I was activating the trust fund, that I was assuming legal control over assets that had been mine since birth, that I was willing to sign a non-prosecution agreement for individuals involved, provided the firm agreed to immediate restructuring and removal of those connected to historical compliance failures. Caleb laughed sharply. "You think you can dictate terms." I met his eyes. "I already am." My father exhaled slowly. He had always respected leverage, even when he disliked the source. He asked if this was revenge. I told him no. Revenge would have been loud. This was resolution. They asked what I wanted in return. Not money, not position, not acknowledgement in public. I told them I wanted my name back, not metaphorically, legally. My mother looked stricken. She said the name was part of the family. I told her it had never truly been mine. She reached for my hand and then stopped herself. Old habits.
The lawyers arrived later. Papers were reviewed. Signatures were placed. The process took hours. No one raised their voice. No one stormed out. That was how these things were handled here, quietly, efficiently. When it was done, the company remained intact. The headlines that could have been written would not be. The structure would change, control would shift. The past would stay buried publicly, though not internally. What they lost was not tangible. It was me. As I stood to leave, my father thanked me for being reasonable. The word struck me as almost funny. I told him reason had nothing to do with it. Clarity did. Outside, the evening air felt lighter than I expected. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel empty. I felt complete in a way I never had before. I walked away from the house without looking back, aware that something had ended cleanly and that the next part of my life would begin without needing to be negotiated.
Chapter 5. I kept my name. The next part of my life began quietly. There was no announcement, no dramatic moment where everything suddenly felt different. Change arrived in documents, signatures, and days that unfolded without interruption. I went back to New York and returned to my routine, but the routine no longer belonged to the person I had been pretending to be. The first thing I did was change my name, not symbolically, legally. Marin Hale appeared on official records within weeks. Bank accounts updated, licenses reissued, professional credentials amended. Each confirmation felt grounding rather than emotional, like placing furniture in a room that had always been mine, but never finished. I did not feel like I was losing something. I felt like I was returning it. The Vivian Hale Foundation was established shortly after. I kept its mission narrow and practical: financial transparency, whistleblower protection, legal support for people who discovered uncomfortable truths inside powerful institutions. I did not want it to be performative. I wanted it to be functional, something my mother would have understood. Daniel Ross published his investigation in stages. He never used my family name. He did not accuse individuals. He mapped structures, decision chains, incentives that rewarded silence and punished scrutiny. It was devastating in the way only well-sourced journalism can be. No outrage bait, just clarity. The response was immediate and restrained, exactly what institutions do when they recognize a threat they cannot discredit. Boards convened, consultants were hired, statements were released that said everything and nothing at the same time. Inside Whitlock Holdings, consequences followed. Caleb was removed from the succession track quietly. No press release, no scandal, just a shift in responsibility that everyone understood without needing it explained. He avoided me after that, not out of anger, I think, but because the future he had rehearsed his entire life had vanished, and he did not yet know who he was without it. My mother stepped down from the board, citing personal reasons. She kept her social standing, she always would have, but she lost the authority she had once exercised without question. I saw her once after that, months later, at a distance. We spoke politely, carefully. There was nothing left to negotiate. My father remained visible, publicly respected, privately constrained. Power does not disappear all at once, it erodes. He understood that. I think he respected me for knowing it too. No one went to prison, no one was publicly disgraced. That mattered. This was not about punishment, it was about consequence, about systems being forced to adjust because the assumptions they relied on were no longer safe. For the first time, I felt unburdened by the need to react. I thought often about Vivian, about what it must have been like to recognize a flaw inside a machine too large to stop, to understand that survival sometimes meant sacrifice, even when the cost was unbearable. I did not romanticize her choices. I did not forgive the system that demanded them. I honored her by refusing to disappear quietly the way she had been forced to. Revenge is a word people use when they want noise, when they want someone else to hurt in a way that looks satisfying from the outside. That was never what I wanted.
Destruction would have been easy, exposure would have been simple. Freedom was harder. Freedom required patience, control, the willingness to walk away without watching everything burn behind you. It required choosing to not inherit a name that came with conditions I never agreed to. I am not a victim. I am not a hero. I am a person who learned the truth late and chose what to do with it anyway. That choice is the only thing that belongs entirely to me. If you are listening to this and recognize something familiar, the pressure to conform, the weight of expectations disguised as love, the quiet fear of stepping outside a role you never chose, I want you to know this. You are allowed to define yourself without permission. You are allowed to take your name back, whatever that means for you. If you have ever been controlled by family loyalty, silenced by obligation, or shaped by a system that benefited from your compliance, I would like to hear your story. Share it. Talk about it. Stay with this channel if stories like mine resonate with you. Sometimes the most powerful form of revenge is not destruction. It is the refusal to live under terms you did not set.